The white feather. The monsoon rain hammered the Vietnamese jungle canopy above Firebase Charlie with the relentless fury that only Southeast Asia could deliver. Through his scope, Marine Scout sniper Carlos White Feather Hathcock watched the tree line, his distinctive white feather tucked into his camouflage boonie hat, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness of November 1967. What started as routine perimeter security was about to become something no Marine Corps manual had ever prepared him for. The coffee in his thermos had gone cold hours ago, but Hathcock barely noticed. Arkansas had taught him patience during deer season, how to wait motionless while rain drummed the forest floor. But this was different. Here, patience meant the difference between going home and becoming another name carved into black granite. At 347 hours, the first muzzle flashes erupted from the jungle. North Vietnamese regulars had chosen the storm as perfect cover for a probe against the isolated outpost. Through the unearthly scope mounted on his Winchester Model 70, Hathcock could see movement, disciplined, coordinated. These weren't inexperienced guerrillas. His rifle cracked once, twice, sending precise .30-06 rounds into the darkness. Somewhere in the tree line, someone's war ended. But through his scope, he glimpsed something that made his blood freeze, a small figure stumbling between the combatants, clearly not a soldier. "Jesus Christ," Hathcock whispered into his radio. "We got a civilian in the kill zone." The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, probably from the nearby village that had been caught between American and NVA forces for months. Children learned to recognize the sound of different weapons before they learned their alphabet here. A burst of AK-47 fire sent him tumbling into a shell crater 20 meters beyond the wire, directly in the kill zone between both forces. In the brief illumination of a flare, Hathcock saw something that would haunt him forever. Blood spreading across the child's torn shirt, soaking into the mud that smelled of cordite and fear. "Base, this is White Feather. We have a wounded civilian, approximately 8 years old, 20 meters beyond our wire. Request permission for immediate rescue." The radio crackled with static before the response came. "Negative on civilian rescue. Too hot. Wait for daylight." But Hathcock knew what daylight would bring. Either the NVA would fade back into the jungle, taking or killing the boy, or artillery would prep the area, leaving nothing alive. The child would become another casualty statistic, another small tragedy in a war full of them. From his position, Hathcock could see the boy moving slightly, one small hand pressed against his shoulder. Still alive. Still hoping someone would help. The white feather in his hat caught a drop of rain and held it, trembling. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. What happened next would later be called the rain carry method, though Hathcock never used that term himself. Years of hunting white-tailed deer in Arkansas had taught him something most snipers never learned: how to move during heavy rain when every other hunter assumed the deer would be bedded down waiting out the storm. "You're not seriously considering this?" His spotter, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, whispered through the comm. "Radio silence," Hathcock replied, already checking his gear. Rain-masked sound, but more importantly, it changed human behavior in predictable ways. Hathcock had noticed something during the firefight that others missed. The NVA gunners were firing high during the heavy rain, instinctively compensating for conditions that didn't actually affect their weapons at close range. They expected movement to be impossible, so they weren't really watching for it. He began his movement at 0410 hours, not toward the boy, but away from him, using a drainage ditch that fed into the crater. The technique he employed was deceptively simple, but required extraordinary patience. Instead of low crawling directly toward the target, he used the rain's natural rhythm. Heavy tropical rain doesn't fall steadily. It comes in waves, building to crescendos, then briefly lessening. During the loudest moments, when rain drummed against leaves and equipment, Hathcock moved. During the quieter interludes, he became perfectly still, even controlling his breathing to match the storm's pattern. More crucially, he used the rain's psychological effect on the enemy. Soldiers in monsoon conditions tend to huddle, to turn slightly away from driving rain, to trust their hearing less. Hathcock counted on this, timing his movements not just to sound, but to the subtle shifts in attention that weather creates in human beings. The mud was thick as Arkansas clay, but warmer. It smelled different too, of jungle rot, and things that died in places where the sun never reached. Each movement required calculation. Too fast, and the NVA would spot him. Too slow, and the boy might bleed out before he reached the crater. 20 meters became the longest distance of his life. Every few feet, Hathcock paused to listen for movement from the tree line. Through the rain, he could hear Vietnamese voices, quiet, professional. These soldiers were disciplined, focused on their mission. They weren't looking for heroes crawling through their kill zone. His white feather, now soaked and clinging to his hat, reminded him why they called him White Feather in the first place. Some said it made him a target, others said it made him a legend. Right now, it just made him a man trying to save a child. The journey took 47 minutes to cover 60 meters. When Hathcock finally slipped into the crater, he found the child conscious, but in shock, a rifle bullet having passed through his shoulder. The boy's eyes went wide with terror at the sight of the American sniper, mud-covered, heavily armed, emerging from the darkness like something from a nightmare. "Toi se gyup ban," Hathcock whispered, slowly removing his boonie hat to show his face. "I will help you." The Vietnamese phrases felt clumsy on his tongue. He'd learned them from a captured enemy manual, never expecting to use them to comfort a wounded child. The boy stared at him, breathing fast and shallow, eyes darting between Hathcock's weapon and his face. Blood seeped through the child's torn shirt, but the wound wasn't immediately fatal. The bullet had passed through muscle and tissue, missing the major arteries. Still, without treatment, infection would set in within hours in this climate. The boy needed real medical attention, not field first aid. Hathcock pulled a field dressing from his kit, speaking softly in broken Vietnamese mixed with English. "It's okay. Kong Sao. No hurt you. We go home now." The boy's name was Duck, whispered so quietly Hathcock almost missed it. 8 years old, just as he'd guessed. Old enough to understand war, young enough to still hope it might end. The return trip presented a new challenge, carrying a wounded child while maintaining the rain movement technique. Hathcock solved this by modifying his approach. Instead of timing movements to rain intensity, he used the storm's effect on vegetation. Heavy rain bent grass and small bushes in predictable patterns. By moving with these natural rhythms, two figures could blend into what appeared to be normal storm movement from a distance. The technique required Hathcock to essentially become part of the weather system, reading wind shifts that preceded rain intensification, using brief moments when lightning illuminated everything to plan his next sequence of movements. He carried the boy pressed against his chest, both of them moving as a single unit through the mud and chaos. Duke whispered something in Vietnamese that Hathcock didn't understand, but the tone was clear. Gratitude mixed with confusion. Why was an American soldier risking his life for a Vietnamese child? It was a question that would echo through both their lives for decades to come. The white feather in Hathcock's hat brushed against the boy's forehead as they moved, leaving a small streak of mud that looked almost like a blessing. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this?" Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. At 06:03 hours, nearly 2 hours after the firefight began, Hathcock delivered the wounded boy to the Marine Corps medic at Firebase Charlie. Hospital Corpsman Second Class, Marcus Webb looked up from his morning coffee, eyes widening, as he saw the muddy sniper carrying a Vietnamese child. "Doc?" This kid took a round through the shoulder, needs immediate attention. Webb didn't ask questions. He'd been treating wounded Marines and civilians for 18 months in country, and he'd learned to focus on the medical emergency first, the politics later. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vitals, cleaning the wound, preparing a stretcher for transport to the field hospital. "He's stable," Webb said quietly. "Lucky. Few inches lower, and that round would have hit his lung." "You did good, Carlos." The NVA probe had ended without them ever realizing an enemy sniper had moved freely through their perimeter twice. In the morning light, Hathcock could see their positions clearly. Professional firing lanes, overlapping coverage, textbook small unit tactics. These weren't the untrained peasant fighters described in intelligence briefings. Rodriguez found him an hour later, sitting in the mess tent staring at his untouched breakfast. "Command wants to see you," he said. "Word is they're not happy about your unauthorized rescue mission." "The hell with Command. That kid's gonna live because of what you did. That's what matters." But Hathcock wasn't thinking about Command disapproval. He was thinking about the way Duke had looked at him, not with the hatred he'd been told all Vietnamese felt toward Americans, but with the simple gratitude of one human being toward another. It complicated everything he'd been taught about this war. Later that day, he watched a helicopter evacuate the boy to a field hospital near Da Nang. Duke would survive, would eventually return to his village after treatment. But the questions his rescue raised would linger at Firebase Charlie long after the monsoon season ended. That evening, Hathcock wrote a letter home to his wife, Jo. He started to describe the rescue, then stopped. How could he explain what it meant to risk everything for an enemy child? How could he describe the moment when war became personal, when ideology gave way to simple human decency? Instead, he wrote about the weather, about missing Arkansas deer season, about counting the days until his tour ended. Some truths were too complicated for letters home. The white feather sat on his bunk, cleaned and dried, waiting for the next mission. Word of the rain carry method spread quietly through Marine sniper units, though few fully understood what Hathcock had actually accomplished. It wasn't a tactical technique that could be easily taught or replicated. It required an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns, animal-like patience, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological insight to understand how environmental conditions affect enemy behavior and attention. 3 weeks after the rescue, a classified after-action report landed on the desk of Colonel Morrison at Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico. The report detailed Hathcock's unauthorized civilian rescue and his innovative infiltration technique. But buried in the technical analysis was something more significant, an observation that would quietly change how the Corps understood counterinsurgency warfare. The report noted that NVA regular forces showed surprising tactical sophistication and unit cohesion, contradicting intelligence assessments that portrayed North Vietnamese soldiers as poorly trained irregulars. More troubling, it suggested that local civilian populations weren't universally hostile to American forces, as doctrine assumed, but were simply caught between competing military pressures. Captain James Sullivan, the intelligence officer who wrote the report, had interviewed Hathcock extensively about the incident. What emerged was a picture of warfare far more complex than training manuals suggested, a conflict where the lines between combatant and civilian, enemy and innocent, weren't clearly drawn. The sniper's actions raised significant questions about current rules of engagement and civilian casualty protocols, Sullivan wrote. If a Marine is willing to risk his life to save an enemy child, what does that say about our fundamental assumptions regarding this conflict? The report was classified and filed away, its implications deemed too sensitive for wide distribution. But it represented something revolutionary, official documentation of what many Marines had begun to suspect. The war they were fighting wasn't the war they'd been trained for. For Hathcock, the aftermath was simpler, but no less complicated. He received no official commendation for the rescue, but he also faced no disciplinary action. His commanding officers understood that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't found in any manual. The incident would later be overshadowed by Hathcock's more famous long-range shots and counter-sniper duels. But among the Marines who served with him at Fire Base Charlie, the night he risked everything to save a Vietnamese boy represented something deeper than military tactical innovation. His white feather had become something more than a sniper's calling card. It was a symbol of moral courage in an impossible situation. Decades later, when military historians studied Hathcock's techniques, they would note that the rain carry method represented a perfect fusion of hunting instincts, combat experience, and moral courage. Proof that in war, the most important innovations often come not from doctrine or technology, but from one person's refusal to accept that some things are impossible. The classified report that documented the rescue remained buried in Pentagon archives until 1995, when it was declassified as part of a broader Vietnam War document release. By then, Hathcock had retired from the Marine Corps, but the questions raised by that November night in 1967 had never fully been answered. In 1998, a documentary filmmaker tracked down Duc Nguyen, now a successful businessman living in Ho Chi Minh City. He remembered the American sniper who saved his life, remembered the white feather that brushed his forehead during their long crawl to safety. "He could have left me there," Duc told the interviewer. "His commanders ordered him to wait, but he came anyway. I never understood why, until I had children of my own." The filmmaker also interviewed Hathcock, now in his late 50s, and battling the effects of multiple sclerosis. The legendary sniper sat in his Arkansas home, surrounded by hunting trophies and military commendations, but he wanted to talk about the rescue mission that never appeared in his official record. "People ask me about the long shots, about the enemy snipers I hunted," he said quietly. "But that boy, that's what I think about when I can't sleep. Not because of what I did, but because of what it taught me about who we really were over there." The white feather sat framed on his wall, yellowed with age but still proud. It had become a symbol of something larger than military precision, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, individual conscience could triumph over institutional indifference. When Hathcock died in 1999, Duc sent a letter to his family. Written in careful English, it simply said, "He saved my life when he didn't have to. I taught my children his name so they would remember that courage comes in many forms." The demonstration of how individual conscience and extraordinary skill could create moments of humanity in the most dehumanizing circumstances would outlast medals, commendations, and tactical innovations. It proved that in war, the most important innovations often come not from doctrine or technology, but from one person's refusal to accept that some things are impossible. The white feather's legacy lived on, not in sniper schools or tactical manuals, but in the memory of a moment when humanity trumped warfare, when one man's choice echoed across decades and continents. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. How long can a warrior carry both duty and conscience without choosing between them?